Welcome to ShockOrama, your source for all things shock, schlock, and just plain bizarre. I'm Ben Sherman, and today we're looking at a true classic, and, dare I say, high watermark of 80s practical effects. That's right, we are looking at the 1986 film From Beyond. Based on a short story of the same name by HP Lovecraft, From Beyond would be the second in a trilogy of Lovecraft adaptations made by director Stuart Gordon and producer Brian Yuzna, coming hot off the heels of their 1985 hit Reanimator, and followed up in 1995 with the direct-to-video movie Castle Freak. Stuart Gordon took a lot of inspiration from Roger Corman's adaptations of Edgar Allan Poe stories back in the 60s, and he decided it would be interesting to do the same sort of thing with HP Lovecraft adaptations, starting with the aforementioned Reanimator, which was an adaptation of the Lovecraft short story Herbert West Reanimator. Gordon also had a background in live theater, and he felt that for these adaptations, it would make everything run a lot smoother if he was working with a recurring company of actors. Barbara Crampton and Jeffrey Combs had both starred in Reanimator, and they would return once again in starring roles for From Beyond. Also returning would be the aforementioned producer and frequent collaborator throughout Stuart Gordon's career, Brian Yuzna, as well as screenwriter Dennis Paoli, director of photography Mac Ahlberg, special effects artists John Carl Beekler and John Nolan, and executive producer Charles Band, founder of Empire Pictures, who released and distributed Reanimator and From Beyond. Charles Band himself is something of a legend within the horror community, having founded Empire Pictures and its successor, Full Moon Features. He's released a fantastic collection of lowbrow marvels over the years, and even directed a couple himself, such as The Ginger Dead Man, Evil Bong, and even Ginger Dead Man vs. Evil Bong. After the success of Reanimator in 1985, Charles Band signed a 3-picture deal with Stuart Gordon. These 3 movies would be From Beyond, Dolls, and Robot Jox. All 3 of these movies would be filmed at Empire Pictures' recently acquired studio in Rome, with From Beyond and Dolls being filmed immediately after one another, and Robot Jox being completed later in 1989. However, its release would be delayed until 1990 due to Empire Pictures going bankrupt. The aforementioned studio was called Dino Chita, and it had actually been built by legendary film producer Dino De Laurentiis, but it was seized by the Italian government when he failed to pay his taxes, and subsequently wound up getting sold to Charles Band and Empire Pictures. Now, if you aren't familiar with the original short story From Beyond, don't worry, it's only a couple pages long. And I read the whole thing, so don't say I don't do anything for you guys. God, the things I do for these stupid videos. The movie is actually an almost entirely new story that's more of a reimagining and expansion upon the original short story. The original story is written from the point of view of an unnamed narrator who goes to visit his friend, a scientist by the name of Crawford Tillinghast. Crawford Tillinghast brings the narrator upstairs to his attic where he turns on his machine, a device that is capable of awakening dormant sensory organs within humans, namely the pineal gland. By stimulating the pineal gland, the machine is able to allow people to experience entities and realms from different dimensions, an experience from beyond. But as with any good Lovecraft short story, things start getting scary fast. Crawford reveals that all of his servants were accidentally killed when a maid turned on the power to the rest of the house while the machine was running, which caused the area of effect of the machine to expand to the entire house, whereupon all of the servants were instantly disintegrated by some terrifying unknown entity from beyond. Tillinghast then reveals that he'd brought the narrator here to kill him the same way, as revenge because the narrator had previously tried to stop Crawford from continuing his experiments. Reality begins breaking down due to the influence of the machine, the narrator pulls out a gun, and then the story ends with a quick explanation that Tillinghast had died from apoplexy, an archaic term which basically means he'd had a heart attack, and the narrator had shot the machine to destroy it. So the basic premise is still there in the movie, but they did change a few things to sort of zhuzh it up, give it that cinematic flair. For the film, Crawford Tillinghast sort of swaps roles with the unnamed narrator. So now, instead of being the sole scientist in charge of the project, he is instead the assistant to a new character, Dr. Pretorius. The pre-credit sequence at the beginning of the film is close to the short story, with Crawford and Dr. Pretorius realizing that their machine works, but not realizing the danger until it's too late. There's also the addition of an upset neighbor and her nosy dog dog who calls the cops on the two men, and also discovers Crawford running out of the house like a madman and Pretorius dead up in the attic. Though instead of a heart attack, it appears that some horrible monster had twisted Dr. Pretorius's head all the way off. And instead of shooting the machine, Crawford destroys it with a fire axe. As I mentioned before, the plot of the rest of the movie is entirely original material, written by Stuart Gordon, Brian Usna, and Dennis Paoli. This was definitely necessary since there's not really much to the plot of the original short story. It's one of those stories that does a good job of introducing a really interesting idea, but doesn't take it very far and leaves the reader wanting more. I'd honestly consider it to be one of Lovecraft's lesser stories, with pretty thin characters and a writing style that I'd describe as overwrought. It gets more interesting in the analysis of the story, since this was a fairly clear metaphor for the discovery of the existence of germs. Excuse me. Research into germs had really kicked into gear by the end of the 19th century, which was fairly recent memory for people in Lovecraft's time period. And the idea of things that you can't see but that are constantly present and can kill you was definitely ripe for horror stories. Filming in Rome began, but not before a couple problems had to be sorted out, like lead actress Barbara Crampton having to scramble to get a passport because this was the first time she had ever left the United States. There was also the problem of transporting all of the special effects from where they were constructed in California to the shooting location in Italy. The huge monster puppets, animatronics, and prosthetics had to be carefully packed away in airplanes, resulting in one incident where a large creation, lovingly referred to as the shrimp chicken, fell out of the back of a plane onto the runway at Da Vinci Airport, where it lay in the sun for over an hour before the film crew was able to get permission from the airport to bring a truck out onto the runway and collect their monster. This was definitely a very interesting day for anyone flying in or out of Rome. There were also a couple cultural challenges to overcome, like when the Italian crew members went on strike because they were not provided with bottles of wine with their box lunches on set. This was quickly remedied, and the Americans even adjusted to the Italian drinking habits quite quickly. But what was not as easy for them to adjust to was volume levels on set. In Italy, the film industry at this time almost never shot with live sound on set, preferring to dub literally all dialogue in post, even for Italian films with native Italian actors. This was extremely frustrating for Stuart Gordon, who preferred to shoot with live sound, as was more common in the US, since he had to constantly cut in the middle of takes due to Italian crew members talking loudly nearby or construction crews hammering next door. But without further ado, let's all take a deep breath as we leap into the colorful and slimy world of Lovecraftian horrors from beyond. The movie opens with the camera pushing in on Crawford Tillinghast, typing away at his computer with a can of Coke on the desk. So already we can tell that this is a more updated version of the 1920 short story. Crawford Tillinghast, played by Jeffrey Combs, takes a deep breath as he finishes typing up the code for a new computer program, and then starts flipping switches on the extensive machinery that takes up the rest of the attic room he's in. Though this is set in the mid-1980s when it was filmed, the movie absolutely nails the mad scientist laboratory machinery. And I should know, since I've covered quite a few mad scientists and Frankenstein's monsters on this channel. Crawford Tillinghast is a bit more cautious than your average mad scientist though, and he only activates the machine to 1/4 of its total power. But this is still pretty impressive as it bathes the room in magenta light and causes a flying eel creature to appear. Aw, what a cute little guy. But don't get too close because he's got a pretty serious bite. Not to be deterred by a little flesh wound, Crawford rushes downstairs to tell his colleague, Edward Pretorius, that their machine works. Dr. Pretorius, played by Ted Sorrell, is so excited about this that he decides to crank the machine all the way up to level goddamn 9,000.
My God.
Crawford wants to turn the machine off, but Dr. Pretorius is enjoying this way too much. And soon enough, it's too late, since the computer explodes, and Crawford realizes that the machine is no longer being powered by any earthly electrical force.
Edward! It's running itself! Something's coming.
Now we get to meet my favorite minor character of the film, Crawford and Pretorius's neighbor and her little white dog.
They're at it again. With the colored lights and the weird sounds. I'm disturbed. Hello?
I imagine that's the exact reaction my neighbors have whenever I'm filming at night. She's trying to call the police on these two mad scientists for being a nuisance, but her dog decides to take a more pragmatic approach, leaping out of the window and rushing straight into the house of Lovecraftian horrors. The neighbor follows her dog inside the house, which is decorated with a very old Betsy Ross flag and a bunch of portraits of American presidents for some reason. Though I do appreciate the detail that the address is 666 Benevolent Street, presumably in Arkham, Massachusetts, a fictional city created by HP Lovecraft, which he references in many of his short stories. It's also the location of Miskatonic University, where Crawford Tillinghast presumably graduated from, as we can see from a t-shirt he is wearing later in the film. Her visit to the house is short-lived, however, as Crawford smashes through the attic door with an axe and runs outside, just in time to get arrested by the policeman waiting outside. The neighbor is screaming and very slowly running down the stairs, but her dog knows exactly what we want to see, and continues upstairs to the attic to find Edward Pretorius's decapitated corpse, with the head seemingly twisted off. While we let the opening credits roll, let's take a moment to look at how this compares to the original short story so far. We've discussed how this cold open is essentially the entire plot of the short story, with a couple adjustments like the introduction of Pretorius, the neighbor and her dog, and Crawford Tillinghast, of course, no longer in the role of the villain. But most of the skeleton of the plot has survived, even down to some smaller details, like the machine powering itself through some connection to a force from beyond. And later in the movie, Crawford will explain that the entities from beyond can only see them if they move. As the opening credits fade out, we see Dr. Block, played by director Stuart Gordon's wife, Carolyn Purdy Gordon. Dr. Block is one of the head doctors at the psychiatric hospital in town, and she's being introduced right now to a Dr. Catherine McMichaels, played by Barbara Crampton. The two doctors are immediately at odds with one another, stemming from opposing viewpoints on the proper treatment techniques for schizophrenics, with Catherine McMichaels having written multiple papers against the practice of locking up psychiatric patients in hospitals, much like the one Dr. Block is running. Dr. Block counters this, accusing Dr. McMichaels of using her patients as lab rats in her own experiments. Catherine is here to evaluate Crawford Tillinghast to determine if he is sane enough to stand trial for the murder of Dr. Pretorius. They meet for the first time in Crawford's cell, where he starts telling her about the experiments he was assisting Pretorius with. Specifically, they were attempting to build a machine that could stimulate the pineal gland, which Dr. Pretorius believed was a dormant sensory organ. Of course, in reality, the pineal gland is important for producing melatonin, a hormone that helps the body regulate its sleep cycle. The idea of the pineal gland serving more mystical function can be traced all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who believed that it acted as a valve to control the flow of pneuma, a somewhat complex concept that can be interpreted as the soul or spirit of living beings. The specific idea of the pineal gland as an extrasensory organ dates back to the 19th century with the famous mystic Madame Blavatsky, who combined it with the Hindu concept of the third eye, which provides perception beyond what people can normally achieve with the five senses. Catherine McMichaels prods Crawford until he goes into detail about exactly what happened that night in the attic, attempting to describe the monstrous creatures he'd seen. He starts getting understandably worked up when it gets to the part where an unspeakable horror ate Dr. Pretorius's head. Dr. Block decides that that's enough excitement for one day, and she has two nurses restrain Crawford as she leads Dr. McMichaels out of the room. Catherine McMichaels asks her to do a CAT scan of Crawford's brain, because she's got a hunch that they might see something unusual, perhaps in the pineal gland region. And she's right. The CAT scan shows that Crawford does in fact have an unusually large pineal gland. Dr. Block is convinced that it's a tumor and that this is what's been causing Crawford's delusions, but Catherine is more inclined to take this as evidence that Crawford's story is real. In fact, Catherine is so convinced that she wants to attempt to recreate Pretorius and Crawford's experiment, in the hopes of seeing these mysterious monsters for herself. The police chief, yeah, I almost forgot. He's been here the whole time.
I've been here the whole time.
Is reluctant to let Crawford out of custody, but he still has a lot of unanswered questions about what happened in the attic. Like, what the hell was all of that slime that Dr. Pretorius' body was covered in? What happened to his head? And how was there not a single drop of blood found anywhere in the room? So he agrees to allow Crawford to be released into Dr. McMichael's custody in the hopes that recreating the experiment will answer some of these questions. Crawford Tillinghast himself is even more reluctant to go back to the house. But as Dr. Catherine McMichaels tells him, it's either come with her or spend the rest of his life in a mental hospital. On their way out the door, they meet Sergeant Brownlee.
I'm Sergeant Buford Brownlee, but my teammates call me Bubba. I used to play pro football. We were all crazy.
Bubba is played by genre legend Ken Foree. He had previously starred as Peter in George Romero's zombie genre-defining film Dawn of the Dead, and would later go on to star in several Rob Zombie films such as The Devil's Rejects, Halloween, and The Lords of Salem. However, many people of a certain age may remember him best as Mr. Rockmore from Kenan and Kel.
Be careful, this coffee is steaming hot.
Much to Crawford's dismay, they have returned to the Pretorius house. And I was pretty surprised to learn that just like everything else in this movie, these shots that are supposed to take place outside by the front gate were actually shot indoors on a soundstage. And the house in the background is a model that, thanks to some clever forced perspective, looks pretty realistic in the final movie. After some gentle coaxing from Catherine, Crawford finally goes inside the house, but just as quickly is able to slip away while the other two look for the circuit breakers. While they're searching the house for their escaped mental patient, Bubba and Catherine stumble into Dr. Pretorius' kink dungeon, complete with homemade VHS tapes of him participating in some pretty intense BDSM. They eventually find Crawford upstairs in the attic, where he is energetically reliving the night Pretorius was killed, by which I mean wildly swinging an axe to further destroy the machine. After they get him to calm down though, Crawford almost immediately starts working on fixing the machine, while Bubba makes some delicious looking shepherd's pie downstairs. Throughout filming for this movie, Barbara Crampton apparently started a tradition of baking biscuits every weekend and inviting her castmates over to her apartment for nice meals. From the interviews I watched, it sounds like everyone had a fantastic time getting to explore Rome, particularly Jeffrey Combs, who mostly went out with cinematographer Mac Alberg, who was fluent in Italian and knew all of the best local cafes and restaurants that tourists don't know about. While Catherine takes a short nap, Crawford opens up to Bubba about what it was like living with Dr. Pretorius, who used to frequently bring beautiful women home with him to torture in his dungeon, which may not always have been fully consensual from the way that Crawford talks about it. Also, the way he describes Pretorius of being unsatisfied with the five senses and always wanting more reminds me of another classic horror movie that would come out only a year later, Hellraiser.
Explorers in the further regions of experience. Demons to some, angels to others.
Let me know in the comments if anyone's interested in me doing a video on that movie, because there's a lot of interesting stuff to analyze in it. Crawford announces that after a couple modifications, he's been able to get the machine back in working condition. However, he warns Catherine and Bubba not to move when he turns it on, otherwise it will see them. This is another plot point taken straight from the short story, where Crawford Tillinghast tells the unnamed narrator not to move, otherwise the entities from beyond will be able to find him and disintegrate him. Catherine agrees, but Bubba has been having a hard time believing Crawford is anything other than a raving lunatic, and all this talk of a mysterious it is not helping.
Just want you to stop saying odd shit.
The machine is turned on, bathing everyone in a headache-inducing magenta light. It seems to be having some other effects as well, as Crawford and Catherine make eyes at each other, but they're interrupted by the appearance of the eel creature from the beginning of the movie that bit Crawford's cheek. Only now it's accompanied by several jellyfish creatures that are just as bitey as the eel. This is also a reference to the short story where Lovecraft described several of the entities that the narrator sees as looking like jellyfish. Crawford decides that this has gone far enough and goes to turn off the machine, but he's stopped by the voice of Edward Pretorius. Pretorius steps forward from the shadows, looking very slimy and very naked. Crawford can't believe his eyes, and Pretorius invites him to step forward and touch him to prove that he's really there. However, Crawford's hand just sinks through Pretorius's skin like a pile of Play-Doh, which makes Pretorius laugh. Then, in a very Freddy Krueger-esque move, Pretorius rips all the skin from his face, declaring that it's just a body, but the mind is indivisible. Then, his face explodes into a bunch of fleshy flaps that wriggle around like worms in one of my favorite effects in the movie. I guess the others weren't too impressed by it though, and Crawford manages to turn the machine off before Pretorius can attack them. The next morning, over breakfast, Crawford and Bubba are both still shaken by their experience, but Catherine is bubbly and excited, eager to turn on the machine again. She theorizes that the enlarged pineal glands that Crawford and now Bubba and herself are all experiencing could be similar to what happens in the brains of schizophrenics, and Crawford's machine could revolutionize research into schizophrenia. Because my dad is an actual neuroscientist, I felt a need to do a little bit of research and see if any of this is even remotely close to reality. It turns out that in many cases the pineal gland is actually slightly smaller in schizophrenia patients, causing it to produce less melatonin and negatively affect the quality of sleep. Bubba then asks Catherine why the machine made them all sexually aroused, and Catherine explains that the pineal gland also regulates sex drive, and the stimulation of the pineal gland could have also stimulated their reproductive organs. This I also looked up, and it turns out she's kind of right. According to a 1996 study I found online, it plays an important role in seasonally breeding animals. However, as humans don't have a specific season for breeding activities, it likely doesn't play as strong of a role in humans. The pineal gland does seem to play a role in neuroendocrine regulation in reproductive organs, meaning that it can control hormone levels. The jury seems to be out on just how important the pineal gland is to sexual health though, but the general consensus seems to be that there is likely a connection. So I give this science fiction monologue a grade of D-. Please see me after class. And now, let us return to our movie about Lovecraftian horrors from beyond our reality. There's some more arguing, with Catherine insisting that what they could learn from using the machine could save lives, whereas Crawford and Bubba are in agreement that further use of the machine would be dangerous and reckless. They all eventually agree to get some rest and then leave the house for good. Catherine seems to be having trouble sleeping due to her pineal headache, and she sneaks upstairs to look at the machine again. She turns the machine on, basking in that magenta glow, and we can see that her interest in the machine has gone beyond mere medical applications. Downstairs, Crawford senses that the machine has been activated when his pineal gland starts pulsating out of his head. Also, is that a Miskatonic University shirt he's wearing? Bro! That's my alma mater! Crawford rushes upstairs and tries to get Catherine to turn off the machine, but she's already too far gone, saying the same kinds of things that Pretorius said.
I have to see more. Feel more.
She stops Crawford from turning off the machine with some intense kissing, but then Pretorius appears once again, and now we can see that he has been further assimilated into the beyond, looking very melty with his arm fused to his torso. And if you think he looks slimy now, just wait until a bit later in the movie. For this film, the crew went through over 100 gallons of slime, since Stuart Gordon had a more is more approach with it to make his special effects extra gross. It was so much slime, in fact, that they weren't able to source it locally in Rome, instead having to ship the dry ingredients over from Los Angeles and mix it at the studio. One of the main ingredients for their slime was the same kind of food thickener that McDonald's used for their milkshakes at the time, and unfortunately this came back to bite them in the ass. Unsure of how fast they'd be going through all of that slime, the crew decided to just mix it all at the very beginning of production, not realizing that it would all go bad within a week or two. From interviews with the special effects artists, it sounds like some of them are to this day still traumatized by just how bad it smelled by the end of shooting. Before Crawford can turn off the switch to deactivate the machine, Pretorius shows off his Stretch Armstrong impression and grabs Catherine from across across the room. Crawford starts sprinting down the stairs to turn off the circuit breaker for the entire house, but unfortunately Bubba has just woken up from his nap, and thinking that Crawford is trying to escape from them, he tackles him down the stairs. Now, some sharp-eyed viewers might notice that as they tumble down the stairs, Bubba seems to be leaving some dark splotches against the wall. That's because for this shot, that wasn't Ken Foree. Instead, the crew used an Italian stunt double that they painted to be Ken Foree's skin tone. At least Ken Foree seems to have a good sense of humor about it now, but it still weirds me out that they essentially did up a guy in blackface to get this shot. Pretorius is starting to get really handsy with Catherine, showing off to her that he can do the hot dog fingers from Everything Everywhere All at Once.
It just doesn't matter how many times I see it, I'm so...
Luckily, Bubba has realized what's going on and accompanies Crawford down to the basement to find the circuit breaker. Unfortunately, the effects of the machine have now extended to the entire house, and when the two of them get to the basement, they are greeted by a giant worm creature. While the two of them try and fight their way past the giant basement worm, Pretorius has now turned his face into something resembling one of the graboids from Tremors, which wouldn't be coming out for another 4 years, so I guess that means that Pretorius can see the future. The giant worm in the basement posed some unexpected problems for the crew. They had created the effect and built a very impressive rig with cables to move it around, but what no one had factored in before shooting the scene was the effect that water would have on the puppet. It apparently acted like a sponge and soaked up a bunch of water to the point where it tripled in weight, and the crew was unable to operate it anymore. So shooting came to a halt while they got some bigger pulleys and heavier gauge cables. But they did a fantastic job because you can't tell in the final movie and the effect looks great. Both Catherine and Crawford start getting their heads chewed on by worm creatures, until Bubba finds the power cables connected to the circuit breaker and pulls them out. Catherine is emotionally traumatized by the experience, and Crawford is physically traumatized, the worm having ripped out all of his hair and leaving nasty rashes and bruises all over his body. Catherine seems remorseful for what happened to them at first, but quickly reveals that the only lesson she's taken from this is not to let Bubba and Crawford interfere in her experiments anymore. She is clearly addicted to the beyond and the effects the machine is having on her pineal gland. Bubba yells at Catherine because there is no way in hell he's gonna let anyone turn that machine back on. He starts moving all of their things into the van and tells Catherine to get dressed, but Catherine has other ideas. She starts exploring Pretorius's old kink dungeon and finds a cabinet that is full of leather BDSM gear. She puts it on and starts straddling Crawford, who is still unconscious on a bed. Jeffrey Combs cites this scene specifically when talking about why he didn't enjoy playing Crawford as much as he had playing Herbert West in Reanimator. Where Herbert West had been the driving force moving the plot along in Reanimator, in From Beyond, Crawford Tillinghast is much more passive, with things just happening to him and very little control over the action. I definitely see where he's coming from, and while his performance is still great in From Beyond, I think he got to be much more iconic in Reanimator. Catherine is still straddling Crawford when Bubba re-enters the room, and he is not happy to see how out of control Dr. Catherine McMichaels has become. When she tries seducing him, Bubba grabs her and thrusts her in front of a mirror, which snaps her out of it. Unfortunately for all of them, the power cables to the circuit breaker in the basement have reattached themselves with a powerful electrical current. The machine is powering itself back on. The machine waking up also wakes up Crawford, who tells the other two that he can hear the machine running upstairs. Bubba rushes to the attic, but can't get close to the machine since it's learned to defend itself by zapping him whenever he goes for the power switch. That's not the only new trick the machine has learned. When Crawford and Catherine come up, a swarm of interdimensional bees is summoned to attack them. Bubba tries pulling the power cables out of the machine unsuccessfully, and even tries chopping the cables with an axe. But the electrical current is just too powerful, and it even jumps across the severed ends of the cables. Bubba does figure out that the bees are attracted to light, and uses a flashlight to get them away from Crawford and Catherine. But then he drops the flashlight and it shines in his face, causing the bees to attack him instead. Unfortunately, this is the end for Bubba, as the bees attack him and eat him all the way down to the bone, until he's nothing more than a head attached to a gooey skeleton. The bee swarm effect was created with nothing more exciting than a number of large fans and a whole bunch of styrofoam balls. Ken Foray demonstrated what a patient person he is when one of the styrofoam balls went deep into his ear canal, and shooting had to pause while the crew tried to carefully fish it out of his ear. For the effect where his whole body is eaten away except his face, they took advantage of their specially built raised flooring, having Ken Foray stick his head through a hole in the floor that was aligned with the skeleton body. This was just one of several effects that used the raised floors, since there's several puppets later in the movie that also required operators to move them from underneath. This sounds like it was actually pretty fun, except for all the slime. Since the floors weren't fully sealed, all the slime that was dumped on top of the puppets would eventually drip down through the floors and get onto the puppeteers underneath, meaning they ended every shoot day with their clothes saturated in this extremely smelly goop. Crawford and Catherine have no time to mourn their friend though, as Dr. Pretorius has now almost completely morphed into his final form. A hideous, slimy creature with elongated tentacle-like limbs and a pineal gland that is fully extended out of his forehead and able to move on its own. It's such a cool puppet. God, I love practical effects. The Pretorius monster restrains Catherine with one of its tentacles and goads on Crawford, telling him to allow the transformation to take over. Eventually, he sprouts a pineal gland growth of his own, which waves around in a wriggly way that makes me say, gross. This makeup effect was quite labor-intensive to apply, and it sounds like it did take a psychological toll on poor Jeffrey Combs, who unfortunately had to wear it for an extensive portion of the movie. He recounts a story in an interview where, after getting his makeup applied for the day, he decided to step out of his dressing room for a second, not realizing that there was a commercial being filmed at the studio that day. He came face to face with a group of 25-year-olds who all looked at him in absolute terror and ran screaming to their mothers. Poor Jeffrey Combs retreated back to his dressing room for the rest of the day, and he said in an interview that this was his lowest point filming the movie. The extended pineal gland effect was achieved in most close-up shots by having a bunch of mechanical gear hidden underneath Jeffrey Combs' bald cap and makeup, and the mechanical parts had to be operated by a crew member using a joystick. It sounds like it wasn't very fun for Jeffrey Combs to be walking around set constantly accompanied by this crew member. I really love this movie, but I just feel so bad for Jeffrey Combs. In most of the interviews he did for it, it just sounds like he had so many problems during filming, and even during pre-production, he had reservations about playing the lead character, thinking that his co-star from Reanimator, Bruce Abbott, would have been a better fit. Catherine manages to escape from Pretorius by spraying the machine with a fire extinguisher, causing it to malfunction and turn off. The next thing we know, both she and Crawford are in the hospital. In a scene that was originally butchered by the MPAA, much to Stuart Gordon's frustration, Dr. Block, that doctor from the beginning of the movie who had been treating Crawford and voiced her contempt towards Catherine's treatment methods, is attempting to grab Crawford's extended pineal gland, which we can see is able to retract itself back into his forehead. Though Stuart Gordon had wanted to go for a more serious tone with From Beyond than with Reanimator, it's darkly humorous scenes like this little game of peekaboo that are a staple of his directing style. Dr. Block gives up when a nurse tells her that the police have arrived, because you know she would never miss a chance to declare Dr. Catherine McMichaels clinically insane.
You're contemptible. Look at her. I doubt she even understands what she's done.
The police chief is understandably pretty upset that Catherine's reckless behavior has cost the life of one of his best men, and he's more than happy to hand her over into Dr. Block's custody. Dr. Block is excited to get started with her revenge on Catherine, and orders a nurse to prepare Catherine to receive electroshock therapy. During all of this, Crawford is woken up, and he has quite an appetite. But regular food won't do, as his pineal gland compels him to another room in the hospital. Dr. Block goes back to check on Crawford and calls security when she discovers he's missing, but she doesn't have to go too far to find him. There's a suspicious pool of blood coming out from under the door to the pathology lab, and inside she finds Crawford crouching over a biohazard bucket, munching on a human brain. The brain that he's eating in this scene was actually just a rubber prop with a bite mark carved out of it, and Jeffrey Combs was simply miming eating it. However, Stuart Gordon was a real stickler for doing everything he could to make things seem more realistic, and he demanded that someone find something to put in the brain to have Jeffrey Combs actually eating. One crew member suggested using a kind of dental cement, which was pink and non-toxic. However, when they started shooting again, the dental cement sucked all of the moisture out of Jeffrey Combs's mouth immediately, and it became clear instantly to everyone that he was not capable of speaking while having that in his mouth. Stuart Gordon decided to try it himself, and when he saw that it was indeed virtually impossible to speak with it in his mouth, they decided to just go back to having Jeffrey Combs mime eating out of the brain again. Crawford seems to come back to himself for a moment, looking down at the brain in horror and pleading with Dr. Block to tell him what's happening to him.
What is happening to me?
But right before she can lead him back out into the hallway, Crawford's pineal gland starts pulsating again, and in the most infamous scene in the movie, he slams Dr. Block against the wall and starts sucking her brain out through her eye socket. Stuart Gordon said that the MPAA woman who met with him to talk about all the problems that they saw with his film was a retired librarian, and she gave him quite the scolding for how he shot this scene in particular. Catherine is just about to get her brain fried by a male nurse when two security guards enter the room and tell the nurse that there's an emergency and he has to go. The nurse seems way too upset about not being able to administer the zaps to Catherine, so it's pretty fun to watch when she knocks him out by slamming his head with a surgical light. Crawford makes it outside of the hospital in one of the only shots not filmed on a soundstage, but instead outside at one of the studio's loading bays. He spots Catherine escaping in a van just as an ambulance arrives. Two paramedics hop out and start carefully taking out a man on a gurney. Crawford's pineal gland starts pulsing again, and he kills the two paramedics, stealing one of their jackets and then driving off in the ambulance. Catherine is back at the Pretorius house now, and this time she is determined to destroy the machine by any means necessary. I mean, she's really not messing around, guys. She found one of those classic bombs with a timer on it that you only see in movies, and she goes right up to the attic, arms the bomb, and walks right back down. Or at least she would have if Crawford didn't grab her on the way down and pull her into Pretorius' dungeon room. She tries reasoning with him, telling him that they've only got a couple minutes before the bomb goes off, but Crawford is fully under the control of his pineal gland's horrifying appetites. When Crawford leans in to start sucking Catherine's brain out of her eye, she gets his pineal gland in her teeth and bites it out of his head. Damn, that's gotta hurt. During all of this, sparks have started flying downstairs by the circuit breaker as the machine begins to power itself back on. Soon enough, the entire house is bathed in that magenta light that we're all too familiar with, and as Crawford recovers, the Pretorius monster appears yet again, grabbing the still chained up Catherine. Crawford recovers quite quickly though, and begins goading Pretorius using the oldest insult in the book.
She'll know, Edward, how pathetic you are! How you can't make love! Maybe you could teach me.
Pretorius may be an interdimensional monster, but even he can't ignore that kind of insult to his manhood. Crawford runs downstairs as the Pretorius monster chases him, but then stands his ground, declaring that he's not going to run away anymore. The Pretorius monster grows wings and flies down towards him. Oh, hey, that's the shrimp chicken that I was telling you about before. You know, the one that fell out of the back of an airplane at Da Vinci Airport and traumatized hundreds of travelers while it was laying on the runway? Well, I guess it could have been worse, because the shrimp chicken flies down, latches onto Crawford's head, and literally twists his head off. So now we also finally know exactly what happened to Dr. Pretorius that first night when he got eaten. The time bomb has still been ticking away this whole time, and Catherine is still trapped in Pretorius' room. She sees some of those floating eel creatures and, thinking fast, begins shaking the chains on her wrist, trying to attract their attention so they'll bite her free. She runs downstairs, but is stopped by Crawford's headless corpse and the Pretorius monster still munching away on it. So she runs back upstairs to the attic and is confronted yet again by the Pretorius monster. And now I really need to tell you about this specific special effect because this is the last time we'll see it. There are two different versions of the Pretorius monster that we see throughout the movie. One that's a full puppet with an animatronic head, and one that's basically just an extension off of actor Ted Sorrell's actual face used for close-ups of him speaking. Originally they had planned to only use the puppet version with the animatronic face, since it was set up to do complex facial movements so it could talk. However, the effects artists in charge of operating this animatronic version had a very tight schedule, and they had to fly back to the US immediately after filming these scenes, so there was no opportunity for them to do reshoots. Unfortunately, what the filmmakers discovered after the artists had left was that while the face looked really cool, none of its lip movements could be synced up to the dialogue. So they had to figure out a different way to get these shots of Pretorius talking. What they settled on is what we see in the final movie. They basically just took the existing puppet, removed the animatronic face, and then the makeup artists attached the neck to the back of Ted Sorrell's head, and then they carefully positioned the camera so that they wouldn't accidentally show the rest of Ted Sorrell's body sticking out from underneath the neck. Honestly, I think this ended up working out better for them, since it means we get to see more of Ted Sorrell's fantastic villain performance throughout the entire movie. Speaking of monologues, Pretorius is just about to start one, but he gets interrupted by Crawford Tillinghast climbing his way out through Pretorius's mouth. Thus begins the slimiest scene of the movie as Crawford and Pretorius, both now inhabiting the same body, begin a fight to the death until they are both reduced to a puddle of jumbled limbs and slime. Catherine escapes by jumping out of the attic window just as the bomb goes off with a very nice explosion. Mwah. Catherine survives the fall, albeit with a bone sticking out of her leg, and is discovered by a group of neighbors who are no doubt quite curious as to why the abandoned house down the block just exploded. Hey look, there's that neighbor lady and her dog from the beginning of the movie. Oh my god. That means we're 2 for 2 on cute animals surviving horror movies. I am killing it. I mean, I'm not killing it, I'm saving it. I saved both of these animals. The movie ends with Catherine telling the neighbors that it ate him, and then scream laughing her way into the end credits. This is definitely one of my favorite movies I've covered so far. The number one problem that most horror and exploitation movies face is pacing, but From Beyond keeps things tight and fun. Stuart Gordon showcased a real talent for knowing exactly how to deliver on the monsters promised by the iconic poster art. There's really no moment in the film where I didn't feel fully engaged. Even the moments where the main characters get some downtime felt more like perfectly timed out moments for them and for us, the audience, to process whatever gruesome special effects had just been showed off in the previous scene. And these scenes serve to keep the momentum of the plot moving forward, either through showing Catherine's increasing obsession with the machine, or through showing Crawford's continuing body horror transformation. You don't even have to take my word for it, since the famous film critic duo Siskel and Ebert gave it a surprisingly positive review, and those guys were notoriously harsh on most horror movies. Gene Siskel found the film largely entertaining and praised the acting performances and Stuart Gordon's direction. Roger Ebert, on the other hand, had a more lukewarm take, saying that From Beyond lacked the driving tension that he enjoyed so much in Reanimator. I think From Beyond still had tension, but what it really lacked was Reanimator's sense of humor. From Beyond was played much more seriously than Reanimator, and I just think that the film could have benefited from more scenes of playfulness, especially in scenes where the three main characters are starting to build up a camaraderie. And that's all I've got for today. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And, as always, stay weird.